Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It started with a simple question: who else knows? I'd been sitting at my desk for hours, scrolling through files on my computer, when I stumbled across them, strange files, each titled with my name, followed by dates and times I didn't recognize. The files weren't something I had ever created. They weren't from emails, and they weren't documents I had opened recently. But there they were, sitting on my desktop like they belonged there. I clicked on one. The first thing I saw was a list of personal details, things I had never input into any system, things that only a few people in my life knew. My birth date, my childhood address, my phone number from years ago, one I hadn't used in over a decade. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it wasn't just my personal information, it was a log of my daily life. Every action I'd made in the past week, from the movies I had watched to the food I had eaten, was recorded in unnerving detail. I scrolled down further and saw notes on the conversations I'd had, times when I'd been alone, and even where I had walked on my lunch break. I had no memory of inputting any of this, yet it was there, staring back at me. Who was doing this? I closed the file quickly, feeling my heart race. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. I tried to tell myself it was just some kind of glitch, some weird software error. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I opened another file, the same format, but this one was different. This one felt like a shadow moving behind me, something lurking just beyond my reach. The file detailed interactions I didn't even recall having. Conversations with people I'd never met in places I'd never been. I read a line that stood out. She said she would be watching. I glanced over my shoulder, my breath caught in my throat. The room felt colder than it had moments before. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was ridiculous, right? I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything suspicious. It was just a file. Just data. Nothing to be afraid of. But then the lights flickered. I froze. My computer screen wavered for a split second. Then the screen went black. Panic surged through me as I reached for the power button, but before I could press it, the lights came back on. The screen flickered again, and suddenly, a new file appeared. This one wasn't like the others. This file had no title, no name, just a date and time. Last night. My breath hitched. I didn't open it immediately. Something held me back, like a primal instinct telling me that I didn't want to know what was inside. But curiosity won out. I clicked the file, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a picture of me. Not a selfie or a photo I'd taken, but a photo of me in my own living room. I was sitting at my desk, just as I was now, looking down at the screen. But the picture was taken from behind me, like someone had been standing just a few feet away, watching me. I scanned the image quickly. The only thing different was a figure in the background, a shadow, just beyond the doorframe of my bedroom. But there was no one else in my apartment. There was no one there. I backed away from the computer, my mind racing. How could this be possible? I had to check the other files. The list seemed endless now. They were all versions of the same thing, logs, pictures, accounts of my every movement. Each file grew more detailed, more intimate. At one point, the recordings even began to describe my dreams I hadn't shared with anyone. I tried to shut the computer down, but the system wouldn't respond. It was like I had no control over it anymore. The cursor moved on its own, clicking on another file. This one was different. It was an audio recording. I didn't remember recording it. I pressed play. A voice came through the speakers, faint at first, but then clear enough to make my blood run cold. "I can see you. I know where you are." The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. The room grew colder again. My skin tingled, my body frozen in place, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The voice continued. "You won't escape. It's too late. I've already taken control." A sudden crash from outside my apartment door made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through me. Was someone really here? I didn't know, but I didn't want to find out. I ran to the door, my pulse racing. My fingers fumbled with the lock. The crash came again, louder now, and I could feel the tremor in the air. But as I opened the door, nothing. There was nothing out there. Just an empty hallway. But the sound still lingered. The feeling of someone or something watching. My mind was reeling. How could anyone be controlling my computer like this? Who had access to my life in such detail? As I turned back to my desk, the monitor lit up once more, the cursor blinking in the corner. A new file had appeared, titled, "Don't you see? You're already mine." I tried to close it, to disconnect, but it was too late. The files were everywhere now, filling the screen, taking over every inch of the computer. And in the corner, that shadow, the figure, the one in the background of the photo, moved again. Slowly. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that it was no longer in the photo. It was standing in the corner of my room. I could hear its breathing. And I was trapped. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, the weight of the figure in the corner pressing down on me. My heart pounded so loud that it seemed to drown out everything else, but I could still hear it, the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't just the hum of my computer or the soft creak of the apartment settling. This was different. This was real. It was coming from the corner of my room where that shadow, that figure, had been standing. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if my voice had been stolen from me. My body froze, paralyzed by fear, my mind racing in panic. What was it? Who was it? How did it get here? I was suddenly aware of the cold air around me, the temperature dropping as the figure in the corner seemed to shift. The shadow grew darker, more defined, until I could almost make out the shape of a figure, a tall, hunched silhouette. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. The room seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The lights flickered again, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. I turned, hoping against hope that the figure would disappear, but it didn't. It was there. It had always been there. And now I was certain it was watching me. The computer screen, still flickering with the files that had taken over my life, displayed one last message. It was the same voice, only this time it was louder, clearer, more insistent. "You can't hide from me. You'll never be alone again." I felt my stomach lurch. The room began to close in around me, the walls stretching as if they were about to collapse. The figure took a step forward, its footfall like the creak of old wood beneath its weight. It was moving toward me. I had to get out. I had to escape. But as I moved to run, my legs wouldn't cooperate. The moment I took a step, the lights blinked once more and everything went dark. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't see a thing. My hands shot out, desperately searching for the desk, the walls, anything to ground me in the nothingness. I could feel my breath shallow, panicked. Then, suddenly, the lights came back on, just for a moment. But in that brief instant, I saw it. It wasn't standing in the corner anymore. It was closer. I could see the faint outline of its face, or at least what I thought was a face. It was twisted, inhuman, stretched out of shape, with hollow, empty eyes staring right through me. Its mouth was open wide, too wide, and I could hear the faint, guttural whisper of its voice again. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. My head spun. It was as if the very air in the room was thickening, becoming harder to breathe. The shadows seemed to grow, swallowing the light, distorting the familiar features of my apartment. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But before I could turn to the door, I heard it again, the voice, soft at first, then becoming louder, more insistent. "You didn't listen. You didn't notice." I spun around, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. The room was back to normal. The computer was shut off, the files no longer visible. Had I imagined it? I didn't have time to question it. I rushed to the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, desperate to escape. But just as I grabbed it, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hands shaking. There was a new notification. It was from an unknown number. I opened it. A single message, no subject, no name, just the same words that had been haunting me all night. "I know you're scared." I dropped the phone, the screen shattering on the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the broken device. How was it possible? How did this person, or thing, know? How could they be everywhere, controlling everything around me? I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, searching for any sign of the figure. But nothing. No movement. Just the echo of my own breathing. And yet, the voice was still there, whispering in my mind, louder than ever. "You'll never be alone again." I ran for the door, my hands pulling at the handle with all my strength. The apartment felt like it was closing in around me, walls pressing together, air thickening with every passing second. And then, I heard it, the soft click of a key turning in the lock. I froze. The door was still locked. No one had entered. But the voice was clearer now, filling my mind. There was no escape. "You should have listened." In that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't just the computer. It wasn't just the files or the messages. It was everything. It was watching me from every corner, every shadow. And there was no way out. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls pressing inward with every heartbeat. I turned to face the door, my fingers still clutching the handle, but no matter how hard I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. It had been locked the whole time, yet the sound of the key turning, of the metal scraping, was undeniable. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to move on their own, swirling in unnatural ways. The flickering of the lights didn't help. They buzzed in an unsettling rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing in the silence. A low hum filled the air, vibrating beneath my skin, reverberating through my bones. Then I heard it again. A soft whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, but it was coming from inside my mind, clear as day. You're not alone. I didn't know what was real anymore. The room looked the same, just my dimly lit apartment, but it felt wrong. The very air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. I could feel the weight of something unseen, something that had been there all along, just waiting for me to realize it. I turned back toward the computer, its screen still dark, still lifeless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that it was aware of me in a way that no computer should be. Every piece of technology in my apartment seemed to hum with a presence, an energy that was wrong, unnatural. It felt like everything I had ever touched, everything I had ever done, had somehow been tracked. All those hours spent online, all the searches, the messages, the websites, I had never been alone. It had all been watched, recorded, analyzed. The faint buzzing continued, now a chorus of static, like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. I could barely make out the words, but I knew what it was saying. We've been waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was racing, spiraling into a panic that I couldn't control. It was like something was pulling me into the screen, pulling me into the dark abyss that was my own life. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me, but before I hit the ground, I caught sight of something that froze me in place. It was the screen, flickering to life. The words were back, bold and clear, filling up the space like a message meant only for me. It wasn't just the files anymore. It wasn't just my personal information. This was different. The words on the screen were a demand, an order, written in jagged, sharp lettering. Come closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It felt like my body had betrayed me, like my limbs were frozen, unwilling to move, unable to escape. Come closer. The words repeated in my mind over and over again. They didn't sound like a request. They were a command, one I couldn't ignore. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, grow darker. My gaze flickered toward the desk, where the broken phone lay, shattered into pieces. A new message had appeared, though I hadn't heard it. My trembling fingers reached for it, and I could feel the weight of the message like a lead weight in my chest. We're already inside. The words stung. They were cold, bitter truth, one I couldn't deny. It was all connected. The computer, the phone, the cameras in my apartment, all of it. It had been watching me long before I realized. The messages weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone, or something, had been in control, pulling the strings, guiding me to this point. What do you want from me? I thought, but even as I asked, I knew the answer. It wasn't just my data. It wasn't just the surveillance. It was me. Everything about me had been logged, cataloged, analyzed. My thoughts, my fears, my deepest secrets. And now it was closing in. The figure I had seen earlier, the one in the corner of my room, it wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. Or at least, it felt real. It was the manifestation of something far greater, something far more dangerous. I looked back at the computer screen. The words had changed again. This time, they were bold and red, burning like fire against the darkened screen. You are the file. The chill in the room deepened, seeping into my bones, and I could feel my vision narrowing, the edges of reality blurring. I glanced at the walls. They were closing in on me. The lights flickered again, and in the split second of darkness, I saw it, a figure in the doorway. I couldn't tell if it was real. It was too quick, too fleeting, but I knew what I had seen. The same figure with that same twisted, distorted face. It wasn't human, not entirely. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood life. I took a step back, my legs unsteady. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I was trapped, cornered by something beyond my understanding. I should have deleted it, I thought, feeling the weight of regret heavy on me. I should have erased the files, shut down the computer, thrown it all away before it was too late. But it was too late now. There was no escape from what I had awakened. As I stood there, frozen in fear, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The air grew thick, the space around me bending and warping as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us now. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voice, the sound of it seeping into my mind, crawling under my skin. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't stop. It wouldn't go away. The figure was getting closer. And I knew, with an undeniable certainty, that there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. The world around me felt like it was crumbling. Every breath I took seemed shallow, as if the very air was thickening with something suffocating. The figure in the doorway, that grotesque silhouette, loomed closer with every blink. My heart hammered in my chest, an unrelenting rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls. Every inch I moved felt like I was sinking deeper into quicksand. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. My body was paralyzed with fear, locked in place by something far more terrifying than any physical force. It wasn't the creature. It wasn't the shadows or the cold presence. It was the realization that it was too late. Whatever had been watching me, whatever had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, was in control now. And it knew me better than I knew myself. You can't escape, the figure whispered, its voice slithering into my mind like oil, slick and cold. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a thing I could comprehend. It felt like a manifestation of everything that had been watching me through the screen, through my life. It was everywhere, in the wires, in the data, in the very core of my being. I closed my eyes for a moment, a desperate attempt to block out the suffocating reality that had encroached on me. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it dug in. The walls around me closed in, pulsating with a low hum that resonated through my bones. I could hear the whispers growing louder, more urgent, more frantic. We see you. I opened my eyes, not sure what I expected to see. But the figure wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. The walls, no, the entire room was alive. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that slithered along the edges of my vision. I could hear them now, the whispers, not just in my mind but in the very air around me, a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Come closer. I didn't want to move. My feet were cemented to the floor, my body a prisoner to the terror that was consuming me. But there was no way out. No escape. The figure was standing right in front of me now, its face distorted, a blur of sharp, jagged edges and hollow eyes. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, not in the way I understood life. It was something else. Something ancient. Its hand reached out, the long, twisted fingers stretching toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flash behind its eyes. Something familiar. Something that made my stomach churn with a feeling I couldn't quite place. It was as if it knew me, knew my every thought, my every weakness. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, choked by the sheer weight of fear that pressed down on me. The figure's hand touched my shoulder, and in that instant, the world around me shattered. The room didn't just collapse, it disintegrated. The walls, the floor, the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. I was falling. The air twisted around me, contorting and warping like a broken image. My vision blurred, and everything I thought I knew about the world, about time, about space, fell away. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I wasn't in my body anymore. I was in a void. A cold, dark place where nothing existed but a vast, empty expanse. And then I heard it. The faintest whisper, growing louder and louder until it became a deafening roar. Welcome to the real world. The sound overwhelmed me, crashing into my mind like a tidal wave. It wasn't just noise. It was a message, a command, a declaration. And in that instant, I understood. I understood everything. The files. The messages. The surveillance. It had all been leading up to this moment. I wasn't just being watched. I had always been watched. My entire life, my every thought, my every movement, it was all part of the plan. A plan I never knew existed. A plan that was now unfolding before me, in this void, in this infinite darkness. I didn't know how long I was there. It felt like hours, days, lifetimes. But eventually, something shifted. The whispers stopped. The roar faded. And in the silence that followed, I felt something, someone reaching for me, pulling me back toward reality. But it wasn't the same reality. It couldn't be. Everything had changed. I was back in my apartment, standing in the exact same spot. But it wasn't the same apartment. The walls were cracked, the lights flickering erratically. The air was thick with an unsettling hum, like the sound of a machine grinding against itself. The computer was still there, sitting on the desk, the screen dark. But I knew it wasn't empty. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly, I reached out for the keyboard. The moment my fingers touched the keys, the screen flickered to life. The words were already there, waiting for me. We never left. I recoiled, my breath caught in my throat. It was too much. It couldn't be real. But as I stood there, frozen, I felt it. The presence. The weight of it. It was still there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that whatever had been controlling my life, whatever had been watching me through the screen, through my every action, wasn't just going to stop. It was just getting started. I couldn't breathe. The screen in front of me flickered again, the message flashing one more time, burning itself into my mind like a brand. We never left. I recoiled, backing away from the computer, but the room seemed to close in around me. It wasn't just the screen, no, it was everywhere. The walls, the air, even the silence, it was all distorted, unnatural, as though I had stepped into a different reality entirely. I tried to tear my eyes away from the screen, but it was like a magnet. The words felt alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't explain. It was almost as if the computer was waiting for me to interact, to respond, to engage with it. I could feel my heart beating faster, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't control. There had to be an explanation, some way to fix this, to undo whatever had been done. But the more I tried to think rationally, the more it felt like the reality around me was slipping away. I moved toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. Maybe if I left, maybe if I just ran out into the streets, the real world, I could escape. But the moment my hand touched the doorknob, I heard it. A low hum, vibrating in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of the house. It wasn't coming from the computer anymore, it was everywhere. The whole house seemed alive, pulsing with the same sinister rhythm. You can't run. We know you. The voice, like 1,000 whispers overlapping one another, echoed in my head, sending a shock of fear through my spine. I jerked my hand back from the door, gasping for air. It wasn't just the words that terrified me, it was the certainty that they were true. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this, they didn't know me. Better than I knew myself. Better than anyone had any right to. I stumbled backward, my thoughts racing. What were they? What were they doing to me? What had they done? The files I had found on my computer, the private data, the messages, the constant surveillance, it had all been part of this, part of something far bigger than I could have ever imagined. I reached for my phone. I had to call someone who could help me, someone who could make sense of all this. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked the screen. I dialed the first number that came to mind, Daniel. My best friend. But as soon as I hit the call button, the screen went black. I stared at it in disbelief, pressing the button again. Nothing. It was dead. Then the room flickered. A momentary flicker, almost imperceptible, like the lights were struggling to stay on. But it wasn't the lights, no, it was the very essence of the room itself. The walls seemed to bend, stretching like elastic, distorting the space around me. We're here. The whisper was so close now. So intimate, so suffocating that I could feel it in my skin, in my bones. My head spun, and for a second, I lost track of where I was. Was this real? Was any of this real? I had to know. I had to figure out how to break free before I lost my mind completely. My feet moved, almost of their own accord, leading me back toward the computer. There was something on the screen now, something I hadn't seen before. It was a list. A series of names. My name, of course, at the top, followed by others. Names of people I didn't recognize. But then there were more, people who had disappeared, people who had vanished without a trace, their fates a mystery that had haunted me for years. I scrolled down the list, each name burning into my mind. How did they know? How did they track them? It didn't make sense. None of it did. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the computer out the window, to destroy whatever had taken hold of my life. But then, as if on cue, the room trembled. The hum grew louder. The walls shook violently, and the lights overhead began to flicker uncontrollably. And there it was. A figure. Tall, twisted, almost unnatural, standing in the doorway. The same shape, the same haunting presence from before. The thing, or things, responsible for everything. I froze. My entire body locked in terror. The creature's face remained obscured by the darkness, its form shifting like smoke, not fully solid, not fully real. It wasn't just a presence. It was the presence, the source of everything that had been haunting me. It spoke again. Its voice was more powerful now, booming through the room like a storm. We have always been here, waiting for you. Watching. Observing. And now we're ready. My body was shaking uncontrollably, but my mind was still racing. The truth was clearer now. The surveillance wasn't just about watching. It was about control. They didn't just want to observe my life, they wanted to become part of it. They had been pulling the strings from the shadows, and now they were ready to make their move. I backed up, my breath shallow, the room spinning. I needed to get out. There had to be a way. But no matter where I turned, the figure remained in the doorway, watching me with eyes that seemed to pierce through my very soul. "It's too late to run," the voice boomed again, this time from all directions. "You are ours." The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me was the sound of my heartbeat, growing louder and louder until it was the only thing I could hear. Then, nothing. The next time I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. It wasn't the same world. The air was thick and heavy, and the floor beneath me was cold and unfamiliar. I tried to stand, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. And then I heard it again. The whisper. The voice. It was everywhere. Welcome to the real world. I was no longer the observer. Now, I was part of the system. And there was no turning back. Have you ever walked down a path and suddenly felt like you were being led somewhere you never planned to go? I didn't mean to be here. One moment I was just strolling through the woods, the sun barely cutting through the thick trees, and the next, I was standing at the edge of a narrow, unfamiliar path. The air felt heavier here. Even the usual rustle of leaves seemed to hold its breath, like nature itself was waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't say. But something told me that this was no ordinary path. The woods were quiet, far too quiet. The usual sounds of birds chirping or squirrels skittering were absent. Instead, I heard something else, a faint, far-off noise, like the whisper of wind through cracks, or perhaps footsteps. I paused. My heart skipped. The thought made me uneasy, but I shook it off. It was probably just my imagination. Still, the strange chill creeping down my spine wouldn't let go. I continued walking, my boots crunching on the uneven ground, the air thick with a damp, earthy smell. The trees leaned over me like old guardians, but the branches didn't seem to reach out in the comforting way they used to. They felt different, almost like they were watching, as if something had changed in the very air I breathed. But what? I couldn't figure it out. Then I saw it. At the end of the path, partially obscured by dense ivy and crumbling stone, stood a building. A building I had never seen before, yet it felt strangely familiar, as if I had been here in some forgotten dream. A tall, imposing structure, the windows dark and empty. The door, half open, groaned as if it were alive, beckoning me inside. I didn't want to go in. The instinct to turn back was powerful. But the curiosity, the pull, was stronger. Something deep inside me urged me forward, as if I had no choice but to follow. I stepped closer, my breath quickening as the air seemed to thicken, pressing against me. The door creaked again, louder this time, as though it had been waiting for me. Just a quick look, I whispered to myself. It's nothing. Just an old building. But as I reached for the handle, something shifted behind me. The sound of footsteps was now unmistakable, closer than before. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned around, expecting to see someone I could explain this odd feeling to. But the path was empty. Yet, the feeling remained. Something, or someone, was watching me. The silence felt heavier now, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood there, my hand still resting on the old, rusted door handle, unsure of whether I should enter. The footsteps were gone, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but everything remained still, too still. The wind had stopped, and even the birds, which should have been chirping somewhere in the distance, were silent. A strange, unnatural calm had settled over the area, suffocating the usual sounds of the forest. I glanced back at the door. It was almost as if it were waiting for me to make the decision, a challenge I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. The building looked ancient, its crumbling stone walls covered in layers of moss, giving it the appearance of something that had been abandoned for centuries. The windows, dark and hollow, seemed to stare back at me, their emptiness unnerving. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to open the door, as though it had been waiting for me, as though something inside knew I was coming. The idea felt absurd. There was no logical reason for me to step inside, no reason at all, but my hand, as if guided by some invisible force, turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the air, breaking the unnerving silence. The moment the door swung wide, a cold gust of air swept over me, sending a shiver through my bones. I hesitated on the threshold, looking inside. The hallway beyond was dark, with a faint, musty smell lingering in the air. The kind of smell you get when things have been left alone for far too long. But there was something else, something faint but distinct, lingering beneath it. It smelled, almost like something rotting. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside. The darkness pressed in on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't just from the lack of light. It felt thick, oppressive, like it was something tangible that could swallow me whole. I looked back at the path I had just walked down, wondering if I could still turn around, if I could just leave and forget this strange moment. But the path, the trees, the very world outside, seemed to blur. The entrance, the place I had been only seconds ago, felt distant, like I was stepping into another world. I glanced at my surroundings again, trying to convince myself it was just an abandoned house, but everything about it felt wrong. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, but the strange thing was that it didn't look like the building had decayed in the usual way. It was as if it had been frozen in time. The layers of dust on the floor weren't thick enough for something abandoned for years, yet the furniture seemed undisturbed, as if no one had touched them in decades. Then, I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the far end of the hallway. A whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it felt like someone was calling me. My heart raced, and my breath quickened. I didn't want to turn around, but I felt an undeniable pull toward the sound. I moved down the hallway slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It was a voice. A woman's voice. But the words were muffled, indistinguishable. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling me, beckoning me forward. I reached the end of the hallway. There, in the dim light, stood an old door, slightly ajar. The whisper seemed to come from behind it. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. Inside was a room that looked lived in. The furniture was old but seemed to be in place, as though someone had just stepped out and might return any moment. A fireplace stood in the corner, cold and empty, and the faint smell of something burning lingered in the air. The floor was covered in a faded rug, and on the walls, old portraits hung crookedly, their eyes seemingly following me as I stepped in. But it was the desk that caught my attention. On it was a single object, a broken necklace, its delicate chain twisted and frayed, the pendant half shattered. I froze. The necklace. I knew it. It was a necklace I had lost years ago. I couldn't explain how it had ended up here, in this abandoned building, but the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. My heart raced. The whispering voice, now louder, echoed through the room. It was unmistakably calling my name. But from where? Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, the noise deafening in the quiet room. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence and that damn whisper growing louder, closer. I could feel it. Whoever, whatever, was behind me. Was I alone in this place? Was I? The door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the floor beneath me tremble. My breath hitched, and for a moment I stood frozen, the echo of the bang still ringing in my ears. I turned slowly, expecting to find a figure standing there, someone or something lurking in the shadows, but the room was empty. The only movement came from the old, faded curtains, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat sending a tremor through my body. I forced myself to breathe, to calm the rising panic in my chest. It's just an old house, I told myself. An abandoned building. Nothing more. I tried to convince myself, but the broken necklace on the desk wouldn't let me forget. I took a step toward it, my feet reluctant, almost as if the floor itself was resisting my movement. The closer I got to the desk, the heavier the air became, and the faint smell of something burning, sharp, acrid, like something forgotten, grew stronger. It clung to the back of my throat, making me feel dizzy. I reached the desk, my fingers brushing the cold, cracked wood. The necklace lay there, still tangled in its broken chain. I couldn't help myself. I reached down, trembling, and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the pendant, a jolt of cold shot up my arm, and the world seemed to shift. My vision blurred, and the air around me grew thick, almost suffocating. A sharp, sudden memory hit me, like a jolt of electricity, of the day I had lost the necklace. It was years ago, on a summer hike through these same woods. I had dropped it, but this wasn't just a memory, it was as if I were reliving that moment, standing in the woods, the necklace falling from my neck, the wind brushing past me. And then, a sound. A voice. Come back. The whisper echoed in my mind, but it wasn't the same one from the room. It was older, more desperate, tinged with something almost familiar. A voice from my past, one I hadn't heard in years. But whose? I blinked, forcing myself to focus. The dizziness passed, and the room snapped back into place, the faint smell of burning still lingering in the air. But the necklace was still cold in my hand, and the memory didn't fade. I couldn't let it go. I turned it over in my hand, staring at the broken pendant. I could feel something pulling at me, tugging me deeper into the room, deeper into the house. The sense of being watched was more intense now, more real. I could almost feel eyes on me, watching from every corner, from the walls, from the portraits hanging crookedly around the room. A flicker of movement caught my eye. One of the portraits, the one nearest the fireplace, had shifted. The figure in the painting, a woman, her face pale and expressionless, seemed to be watching me, her eyes no longer fixed on the distant horizon. They were locked on me now. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The painting was too real, too unsettling. I turned away quickly, my gaze landing on the fireplace. The cold, empty hearth looked wrong. The blackened stone seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though something beneath it was trying to break through. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. A faint creaking sound echoed from the fireplace, followed by a low, guttural noise, almost like breathing. My eyes scanned the room, desperate for something to focus on, something that would make sense of this madness. But there was nothing. No sign of movement. No answer to the questions pounding in my mind. The whisper returned. Louder now. Closer. Come back. Come back. It was unmistakably the same voice, but now it was distorted, warped, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. My head spun. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I turned to the door, but before I could take a step, the air around me thickened, as though something was blocking my escape. The doorway seemed to stretch further away, the hallway behind it growing darker and darker, as if I were being pulled into the very shadows. The portraits on the walls, those hollow-eyed faces, seemed to shift with every glance. I could hear them now, their whispers blending with the voice, like an endless chorus, each one repeating the same words, "Come back. Come back." I reached out for the door handle, my hand shaking uncontrollably, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as though something invisible was holding it closed, trapping me inside. My breath quickened, panic starting to flood my mind. I backed away, my eyes wild, searching for a way out, but the room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. And then, the floor beneath me gave a soft, creaking groan. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like footsteps, moving in the darkness behind me. There was no escape. Not from the room, not from whatever was in it, and certainly not from the voices. I spun around, my eyes wild, but I couldn't see anyone, only shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, shifting like smoke. Suddenly, from the corner of my vision, I saw it. A figure. Standing in the doorway. It was faint at first, like a shadow in the periphery, but then it became clearer. A person. A woman, standing tall, her face obscured by the darkness. The whispering intensified, blending into one long, piercing note, and I could feel it in my bones. She was the one calling me. "Come back," she whispered again, but this time I could hear the fear in her voice. It wasn't calling me. It was begging. I stood frozen in place, my heart beating so loudly I thought it would drown out the world. The figure in the doorway remained unmoving, her form dark and indistinct, like a shadow made flesh. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, swallowing the light. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse, like an ominous lull before the storm. My breath hitched as I realized that whatever I had been running from, whatever was pulling me into this place, wasn't just some trick of the mind. It was real. It was here. And it was watching me. I could feel my legs shaking, my body refusing to move. The woman, if it even was a woman, stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as though waiting for something. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see the faint outline of her features, the way her hair fell in dark strands around her face. The emptiness of her presence gnawed at me, like she was not fully of this world, a reflection of something lost. "Come back." Her voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it rang in my ears with a strange resonance, like it was coming from everywhere at once. "You have to come back." I couldn't move. Every part of me screamed to run, to get out of the room, but my feet felt cemented to the floor. The door behind me, the one that had slammed shut earlier, was no longer an escape. It seemed to stretch impossibly far away, the hallway beyond now a vast, dark void. And then the whispers returned, louder, frantic. But they weren't just coming from the woman. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from every inch of the room. Each voice spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but the meaning was clear. They were all calling me, urging me to do something, to follow them. I glanced at the desk, the broken necklace still in my hand, its cold metal now burning against my skin. It was as though it had become part of the room, part of this twisted reality. The pendant glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light emanating from it, casting strange, elongated shadows across the room. The woman in the doorway took a step forward, her feet moving with a slow, deliberate motion. Her presence seemed to distort the air around her, warping the light in strange ways, as though she existed outside of time. Her voice, now full of desperation, echoed through the room. "Please, you don't belong here. You have to go back. You don't know what you're unleashing." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, constricted by the heavy weight of the air around me. I could feel the floor beneath me shaking now, the walls creaking and groaning as if they were alive, shifting, moving. The shadows began to stir. They moved in ways that were impossible, slithering and crawling along the walls as though they had a mind of their own. They stretched out toward me, reaching for my feet, wrapping around my ankles. I tried to pull away, but the shadows held fast, their grip like ice, cold and unforgiving. The woman stepped closer, her face still hidden by the darkness, but now I could see her eyes. Dark, empty eyes, like two pits of blackness. They locked onto mine with a gaze that sent a chill through my spine, as though they could see straight into my soul. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You were never meant to find this place." Her words cut through the silence like a blade, and I felt a surge of panic rising within me. I couldn't understand what she meant, what place she was talking about. All I knew was that this wasn't right. Nothing here made sense. I tried to back away, but the shadows were pulling me down, dragging me closer to the floor. The more I struggled, the tighter their grip became. My pulse was erratic, my mind racing as I searched for a way out, but the room seemed to stretch and bend in impossible ways. Every direction I turned led to more shadows, more whispers. The walls were closing in. The woman took another step, her voice rising with urgency. "You don't understand. The path you've walked, it isn't just a path. It's a doorway. And it's never meant to be opened. A doorway." I blinked, the word repeating in my mind. The path. The door. This place. It was all connected, wasn't it? But how? Why was I here? "I don't know what you want from me." I managed to shout, my voice hoarse, breaking through the oppressive silence. I just came here by accident." The woman's expression didn't change. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my words. But the shadows behind her seemed to writhe with a life of their own, growing larger, thicker. They consumed the walls, the ceiling, until the entire room felt as though it was collapsing in on me. "Leave now," she said, her voice cold, final. "Before it's too late." Before I could respond, the room tilted, the floor beneath me shifting as if it were no longer solid. A deep, hollow rumble filled the air, and the entire structure groaned, the walls bending at unnatural angles. I stumbled, my feet giving way beneath me, and I fell to the ground. The shadows pulled harder, dragging me toward the center of the room, toward the growing darkness that consumed everything. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the woman's face, still hidden in the shadows, but now her lips curved into a twisted smile. And in that smile, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a smile. It was a warning. And then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, it wasn't the room I had last seen. The walls weren't there anymore. The shadows had consumed them, and the floor, once solid beneath me, now felt like liquid. I was floating in darkness, no light, no sound, no point of reference. Just the endless void. I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as though I were being crushed by the very air around me. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps, each breath pulling in more of the oppressive weight of the darkness. The woman's face, the twisted smile, the empty eyes, was seared into my memory, a grotesque reminder of the warning she had given me. Before it's too late. But what did she mean? What was too late? And where had I ended up? Was this death? A nightmare? A place between worlds? The air around me shifted, pulling at the edges of my mind. Something was changing. A noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of a door creaking open. Slowly, I turned my head, though I wasn't sure how I was even able to. But there it was. A door. It had appeared out of nowhere, standing tall and solid in the center of the dark space. It wasn't like any door I had seen before. It was old, worn, like something that had been forgotten for a long time, but the wood itself seemed to pulse with life. It was faint, a soft glow emanating from the cracks in its surface, but it was enough to make my heart race. It was calling to me, pulling me toward it, even though my instincts screamed for me to run in the opposite direction. I tried to move, to get closer to the door, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the air itself was holding me in place, keeping me suspended in the void. The whispers returned, low and insistent, curling around my mind like smoke. Come back. Open it. I felt the presence of something, no, someone, behind me. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The temperature dropped, and I heard the soft sound of footsteps, faint but growing louder with every passing second. I turned my head, straining against the invisible forces that held me in place, and I saw her. The woman. She stood in the distance, her dark figure silhouetted against the doorway's faint light. Her eyes gleamed with an otherworldly intensity, locking onto mine as though she could see through the very fabric of reality. She didn't speak, but I could hear her words in my mind. Her voice echoed in the silence, a warning wrapped in fear. You don't understand. You shouldn't open it. I felt the door drawing me in, the pull of its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. I could almost hear it now, like a faint hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. The whispers around me grew louder, frantic, urging me forward. Come back. Come back to where it all began. I knew what they meant. The path. The door. The thing that I had stumbled upon when I first walked through the woods. But why was it so important? What was I supposed to find? And why did the woman, that thing, want to stop me? With every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I took a hesitant step toward the door. My legs trembled beneath me, but I forced myself to move, drawn by the need to understand. The closer I got, the more the whispers seemed to wrap around me, becoming louder, more insistent. But there was something else now, something underneath the voices. A low, guttural growl, like an animal waiting to pounce. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool wood of the doorframe, and a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. I gasped, my body jerking in response. The door was no longer just a door. It was alive. And as I touched it, I felt the pull of something far older, far darker than anything I could comprehend. Open it. The voice wasn't hers this time. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was something deeper, something primal. I forced my hand to grip the handle, trembling with fear, but my fingers moved with a mind of their own. The door began to open slowly, creaking as though it had been locked for centuries. A gust of wind rushed through the crack, and with it came the smell of something decayed, something long forgotten. It filled my nostrils, choking me. I could hear the woman now, closer than before. She was running toward me, her footsteps pounding in the darkness. I could see her now, her face twisted in desperation, her arms outstretched as if to stop me. But it was too late. The door was opening. There was no turning back now. No, she screamed, but the door swung wide open, and the world beyond it was not what I expected. It was the woods, but not like they had been before. This was a place frozen in time, a world of endless twilight, with trees that stretched impossibly high into the sky. The air was thick, charged with an unnatural energy. I could see the faint outline of a path leading deeper into the forest, but it wasn't like any path I had ever walked before. It seemed to shift, moving and twisting as if alive. Come back. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just in my mind. It was real, coming from the woods, from the very trees themselves. The same voice, the same call. And I realized, with a horrible clarity, that the path was not just a place. It was a trap. Before I could make sense of what was happening, I felt the pull again, stronger now, drawing me forward, pushing me into the woods. The door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside this twisted, alternate world. The woman's voice was now a distant echo, drowned out by the chaos of the forest. And then, as if to mock me, I heard a new voice. A voice that was unmistakably my own. Come back. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A soft, distant melody filtered through the thin walls of my apartment, a tune that was familiar but unfamiliar all at once. It was late, far past midnight, the city's usual hum muted by the night. The only thing that should have been keeping me awake was the gentle hum of my refrigerator and the occasional car passing by below. But no! This music, it started just a few days ago, echoed from the neighboring apartment. And it wouldn't stop. I was used to the usual sounds that came from the tenants in the building, the occasional door slamming, voices carrying through the halls, a child's laughter. But this was different. This music, it wasn't loud, but it was there, persistent, lingering in the air like a half-remembered dream. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the neighbors were having a late-night jam session, or maybe it was some kind of art project. But the melody, it wasn't just a song. It was a pattern, a rhythm that seemed to repeat over and over, like a memory that couldn't quite be recalled. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented, and the music would be there, seeping through the walls like an intrusion. It would stop, then start again. But even when it stopped, I could still hear it. Faintly, as though it were humming in my mind. I tried to ignore it at first, rolling over and burying my face in the pillow. But the longer it played, the more it gnawed at my thoughts. I couldn't escape it. The next night, it came again. Louder. More insistent. And this time, it was as though the music was waiting for me to hear it. A note would start, then another, each one fading in and out of tune, weaving in and out of my consciousness until I couldn't tell if the melody was in my head or if it was real. I sat up in bed, my mind spinning. I had to find out where it was coming from. I stepped out of my apartment into the hallway. The air felt colder than usual, the building's usual hum replaced by a strange silence, a thick weight that seemed to press down on everything. I walked cautiously toward the apartment next door. The hallway lights flickered, casting long, jittery shadows along the walls. I stopped at the door. The music was still playing, soft but unmistakable. It was so close, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. I raised my hand to knock, but hesitation kept me frozen in place. What if I was wrong? What if it was just a neighbor, nothing more? I didn't want to make a fuss over something that might turn out to be nothing. Then, just as I turned away, something shifted. The music stopped. Dead silence. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what I should do. It wasn't just the music that made me uneasy, it was the sudden absence of it. As if it were never there at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My pulse quickened. I turned back toward my apartment, but just as I was about to reach the door, the melody started again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Each note felt like it was reverberating through my chest, shaking the very foundation of the building. The tune was simple, almost childlike, but there was something haunting about it. It felt familiar, like something I should have known. Something from my past. But the more I listened, the less I could place it. I stood there in the hallway for what seemed like hours, listening to the music swirl in the air. I tried to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe the neighbors had a radio on, or maybe it was just my imagination. But no! This felt different. The music, it felt too deliberate, too personal. As I stood there, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The building seemed to shift around me, the walls feeling closer, tighter. The air was thick, heavy. My breath came faster, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway, which had once been familiar, now felt like a maze, twisting and warping with every second that passed. Was it the music that was doing this to me? Or was I just losing my mind? The melody, those strange, haunting notes, seemed to echo inside my skull. As if they were not coming from next door, but from somewhere far deeper, from a place I couldn't understand. A place that had been calling to me, gently at first, but now with an intensity that I couldn't escape. I returned to my apartment that night, but the music didn't leave me. It followed me, playing over and over in my head, a rhythm I couldn't forget. Even after I lay back down, the notes swirled in my thoughts, seeping into every crack of my mind. It had become more than just noise. It had become a presence. Something I couldn't shake. I stared at the ceiling, feeling like I was being watched, like there was someone, or something, waiting in the shadows, just out of sight. And then, just before I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the apartment next door. It was in my room, right behind me. I woke with a start. The music was back. But this time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't coming from the apartment next door. No, it was in my room, right behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted upright, eyes scanning the darkness. The quiet hum of the city outside had long disappeared, replaced by the eerie, faint melody that had started haunting my nights. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The notes were soft, like the wind catching the strings of an unseen instrument. The tune itself hadn't changed, it was still that same innocent, almost playful rhythm. But now, It felt as though it was playing directly into my mind. Each note was an intrusion, a reminder that something was wrong. I turned my head slowly, trying to keep my breath steady. My room was pitch black, the only source of light the faint glow of the street lamps seeping in through the window. The melody twisted in my mind, and I could almost hear it echoing off the walls, vibrating in the corners of the room. There was no one there. There was no instrument. The music wasn't coming from anywhere. I blinked, forcing myself to focus. It must be the walls again, I thought. Maybe some pipes were creaking, or the pipes that ran through the building were picking up strange vibrations. It was a reasonable explanation. Still, my eyes kept darting around the room, waiting for something to reveal itself. The sound grew louder. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to shut out the melody, but it felt as if it were inside my skull now, reverberating against my thoughts. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The notes twisted into something darker, like a slow crawl in my chest. It was no longer a simple melody, it had become something insistent. It was more than a song, it was a call. A command. I bolted out of bed and stumbled toward the door, but as I crossed the room, I froze. The music was now everywhere. The walls. The ceiling. The floor. It surrounded me, wrapping around my body like a suffocating fog. I grabbed my phone, hoping to get a sense of time to distract myself with the light of the screen, but the moment I turned it on, I noticed something strange. The time on the display had frozen. It was stuck on 2:31 a.m., the same time I had checked it the night before. My stomach twisted. Had I really been awake for that long? No, that couldn't be. I looked back at the clock on the wall. Same thing, stuck on the same time. 2:31 a.m. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of it. Was I hallucinating? Or was the time stuck? Was everything stuck? The air in my room felt thick now, as though the very atmosphere was charged with static. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. And then, with a sharp jolt, the music shifted. The notes now sounded as if they were inside me, vibrating my ribcage, a deep hum that echoed against my bones. It was no longer the same simple melody. The rhythm had changed, it was faster now, erratic. I could feel the pulse of the tune, like a heartbeat, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. I ran out into the hallway, hoping to escape the growing sensation that the music was chasing me. But when I opened the door, I found myself staring at a hallway that was unfamiliar, as if it had changed overnight. The walls were darker, the lights dimmer. The carpet beneath my feet felt thick, heavy, almost like it was swallowing my every step. I moved down the hallway, guided by the faint notes, now a creeping, distorted sound. Something was wrong with the building. I had lived here for months, and this hallway, these walls, had never looked like this. The building itself felt alive, as though it was shifting in response to the music. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the corner, waiting for me. I turned the corner, and there it was. The apartment next door. The one where the music had been coming from. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't think twice before pushing it open. My heart was racing, every nerve screaming at me to run. But I needed to know. I had to know what was happening. Inside, the apartment was just as I had expected, a standard one-bedroom in the same building, but now it looked as if it had been abandoned. The air was thick with dust. The furniture, once neatly arranged, had been upturned. A chair was tipped over on the floor, and the coffee table lay shattered in the middle of the room. There were no signs of life. And yet, the music was louder here. It came from nowhere, filling the room, warping the air with its growing intensity. I stepped further in, my legs trembling beneath me. The melody now felt like it was pulling me, dragging me forward against my will. I stepped cautiously toward the back of the apartment to what had once been a small study. The door was closed. As I reached for the handle, the music shifted again, quicker, harsher, as if it were impatient with me. The door opened with a soft creak. And there, in the center of the room, sat an old, upright piano. But it wasn't playing itself. Someone had to be playing it. I didn't see anyone at first. The room was empty except for the piano, but the melody, no, the notes, they were sharp now, cutting through the air like a knife. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure stepped into the dim light. The figure in the corner barely registered at first. It was a fleeting movement, just a shift in the darkness, but it was enough to make my blood freeze. My entire body went rigid as I stood there, paralyzed in place. The music swelled in the room, now unbearably loud. Every note pounded against my skull, like a drumbeat that didn't belong. I strained my eyes, desperate to make out the figure that lurked in the shadowy corner. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it more clearly. A man, or what had once been a man, standing perfectly still, his back turned to me, his hands resting on the keys of the piano. His posture was unnaturally stiff, rigid, as though he was frozen in place, playing an endless, maddening tune. The melody was growing more distorted now, the rhythm erratic, like a heartbeat that was no longer in sync. The man's hands moved across the piano with eerie precision, his fingers grazing over the ivory keys. But there was something wrong with the way he played. His movements were unnatural, mechanical, as though he was being controlled by something beyond his own will. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to flee from this madness, but my legs refused to move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the sight before me. And then the man turned his head slowly. It wasn't a swift motion, more like a deliberate movement, like a marionette being controlled by unseen strings. The moment his face came into view, I felt my stomach lurch in horror. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, those eyes, were hollow, devoid of any recognition. His skin was thin, stretched tight across his skull, as if he hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't his appearance that terrified me. It was the way his eyes locked onto mine, as if he had been waiting for me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The music was louder now, deafening, a chaotic mix of discordant notes that seemed to drown out everything else. The air around me was thick, suffocating, as if the very room itself was closing in on me. The man's lips parted, and for a moment I thought he would speak. But instead, he just smiled. It wasn't a smile of recognition. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a hollow, empty expression that didn't belong to a person. His teeth were yellowed and jagged, almost animal-like. And as he smiled, the music shifted again, faster, sharper, more insistent. It became a harsh, pounding rhythm, the kind of beat you felt in your bones, like something was crawling through your veins. I took a step back, and that was when I noticed the shadows. They weren't just lingering in the corners, they were moving, twisting, crawling along the walls like living things. The darkness seemed to shift with every note that echoed through the room, as though the shadows themselves were responding to the music. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The man's fingers moved again, but this time the melody wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. a force that felt like it was tugging at my very soul, pulling me closer to him. I could feel it in my chest, this unrelenting pull, like the music was calling me, beckoning me to come closer. I staggered back, my heart racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls distorting, the floor tilting beneath my feet. I was trapped in a space that no longer made sense, a space where time seemed to stand still, and reality itself was unraveling. I had to get out of there, but I couldn't move. The shadows were closing in. The music was too loud, too overpowering. My body trembled, my mind unraveling with every passing second. And then, just when I thought I would lose myself to the darkness, the man spoke. "Do you hear it?" His voice was soft, but there was something strange about it. It was hollow, almost as if it wasn't coming from him at all, but from somewhere else, somewhere deep inside me. "Can you hear the music?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The question was absurd. Of course, I could hear the music. It had been following me for days. It had taken root in my mind. It had invaded my every thought. But as his eyes bored into mine, I realized something. The music wasn't just an external force. It wasn't just some strange sound coming from the apartment next door. It was something inside me, something that had crawled into my mind and taken control. The man wasn't just playing the piano, he was calling me. He was waiting for me to respond. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only stare at the man, at his empty, unfeeling gaze. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. A whisper. A voice, familiar, but distant. It was my own voice. "Come closer." The air around me grew heavier, thicker, suffocating. The shadows seemed to move in closer, coiling around my feet, pulling me towards the piano. The music surged again, louder, more insistent, as though it were feeding on my fear. I tried to resist, but it was too late. The pull was too strong. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were hands. Hands reaching for me, pulling me toward the piano. I took one last, desperate glance at the door, but it was gone. The apartment had disappeared. There was no escape. And then I heard the man's voice again, clear this time, as though he was speaking directly into my mind. "Do you hear it?" he repeated. "The music is the key. The music is everything." And then the room went black. The blackness swallowed everything. It wasn't like the darkness you could feel with your hands, the kind that wraps around you and offers a certain comfort, a relief from the noise of the world. No, this darkness felt different. It was thick, like wet velvet, and it pressed in from all sides, suffocating, smothering. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The music, still there, relentless, had become something else. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was presence. It was weight. The notes themselves had transformed into something tangible, as if the air itself had turned into a string of melodies that tangled with my lungs, filled my throat, weighed down every breath. "Do you hear it?" The voice was still with me. The man's voice. But now it was coming from everywhere. It was in my head. It was in my bones. I could feel it vibrating through my spine, a low hum, pulsing like a heartbeat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to move, to run, but my body was locked in place, frozen in a prison of dark and sound. The shadows, those twisting, crawling things moved again. But now, they weren't just lurking in the corners. They were expanding, bleeding into the walls, the floor, the very air. I could see them shifting, stretching into shapes that weren't quite human, but were close enough to make my stomach churn. They whispered in my ear, their voices cold and alien, and I could almost make out words, half-formed thoughts, half-breaths. They were watching me. But the music, it was everywhere. I had no escape from it. The piano keys that I had seen before, they were no longer separate from the darkness. They had become one with the void, with the shadows. Each note that sounded from them seemed to claw its way into my mind, digging deeper, drawing me closer. "Come closer," the voice whispered again. This time, it wasn't just an invitation. It was a demand. I could feel it tugging at my very essence, as though it was pulling me towards something I could not see but knew I was meant to reach. The man, the figure who had once played that unholy melody, was still with me. Still present, but not in any way I could comprehend. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They were alive. I could feel them, pressing against my skin, curling around my legs, my arms wrapping their tendrils around me. And in that moment, I realized with a sickening twist that they weren't just shadows. They were memories. Forgotten ones, buried deep, brought to the surface by the power of the music. I thought of my past, of the things I had tried to leave behind, of the people I had once known, faces I hadn't seen in years. And I realized they were here now, all of them, waiting for me in the dark. Their eyes, their voices, fragmented, distorted by the music, echoed in my mind. The piano notes shifted again, sharper now, colder. They grew faster, a frantic tempo that mirrored the pounding in my chest. It felt like the music was controlling me, making me relive moments I had tried to forget. Faces from my past flashed in and out, memories like broken glass. The shadows morphed into those faces, stretching, distorting into grotesque forms that screamed at me in a silent cacophony. "Remember," the voice coaxed. "You're not alone. You never were." The phrase sent a jolt of terror through my veins. It wasn't the music anymore. It wasn't just a sound that could be drowned out. It was in me. It was in my mind, in my memories, dragging everything to the surface. It was pulling me into the past, into a place I didn't want to go. I fought against the pull, against the relentless tide of sound and memory. I focused on the one thing I still had, my mind. I tried to fight back, to ground myself in the present, but it was no use. The shadows were everywhere, slipping into my thoughts, into my very essence. The man's face was in front of me again, grinning that same hollow grin, his eyes now wide and empty. The piano keys crashed in a dissonant chord, one final note that shattered the silence. The sound reverberated in my skull like a bell, deafening, vibrating deep within me. I thought my brain might split in two from the pressure of it, and for a moment everything went silent. And then I was somewhere else. The apartment, my apartment, was gone. The darkness was gone. The music, still there, but distant. I was standing in a room, a cold, sterile place. The walls were covered in cracks, peeling paint, and there was a faint, sickly yellow light overhead. This place wasn't real. Or at least, I didn't think it was. It felt like a dream or a memory. A place I had been before, a place that didn't exist anymore. It was familiar, but I couldn't remember why. But there was something here. A presence. I turned, and there it was again, the piano. But this time, it was different. It was aged, decayed, and the keys were chipped and worn. The shadowy figure that had haunted me was sitting in it again, playing that maddening tune. But this time, something was different. The room was filled with more than just shadows. The air felt thick with expectation, and I realized, too late, that I had made a terrible mistake. I wasn't just a spectator here. I was part of the song. I couldn't breathe. The air, thick with the smell of decay, seemed to clog my lungs, making every inhale feel like a struggle. The light above flickered, casting sickly shadows across the peeling walls. The piano in front of me, decaying and monstrous, creaked as if it were alive, as if it were waiting for me to take my place on its cold, splintering bench. I didn't want to move. I couldn't move. It felt like my legs were cemented to the floor, my body locked in place by some invisible force. But the figure, the man, was still there. The hollow eyes. The vacant grin. He sat at the piano as if it was the most natural thing in the world, his fingers caressing the keys with an unsettling tenderness, each note that emerged from the instrument more distorted than the last. The music twisted in my head, louder now, sharper, as though it had taken on a life of its own. It was as if the tune was trying to crawl under my skin, trying to drag me into the dark corners of my mind. "You're here now," the voice whispered again, and I realized that it was no longer coming from the man at the piano. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the air, the floor, they all pulsed with the same unnatural rhythm. It's too late to turn back. I wanted to shout, to scream at him, to demand what was happening, but my mouth wouldn't move. I was trapped, as if the melody itself had woven chains around me, holding me captive in this suffocating space. The man's fingers moved faster now, the melody growing more frantic. Each note was like a hammer against my skull, beating in time with my own heartbeat, and I felt my sanity unraveling thread by thread. The shadows in the room thickened, their shapes distorting and stretching as they slithered across the walls. They seemed to take form, shifting between the familiar and the nightmarish. Faces appeared in the dark corners, faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew. They were watching me, waiting for something. My heart raced as their hollow eyes locked onto mine, their mouths opening in silent screams. The figure at the piano didn't stop. His eyes, vacant and unblinking, never left me as he played. His movements were smooth, fluid, but there was something off about the way his fingers moved, unnaturally graceful, too perfect, like a marionette being controlled from afar. The music was getting louder, sharper, more dissonant. It felt like the very walls were shaking with it, like the building itself was being torn apart by the force of the melody. The pain in my head grew worse with every passing second, the notes stabbing into my brain like needles. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. A voice. Familiar, but distant. My name. Soft, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I turned, searching desperately for the source. But there was no one. Only the man at the piano and the growing shadows that seemed to pull everything toward them. "Who is it?" I whispered, but my voice sounded alien, as if someone else was speaking through me. The music paused. A deep silence fell over the room. I thought I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding in my ears. But something felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. And then, the air shifted, something changed. The shadows parted. In the distance, through the darkness, I saw it. A figure. A woman. She was standing there, just out of reach, her face obscured by the dim light. I couldn't see her clearly, but I knew her. I knew her. The figure began to walk toward me, her movements slow but deliberate. She was calling to me, no, pleading with me, her voice desperate, almost frantic. "Help me," she repeated. "You can stop this. Please." I tried to move toward her, but the man, stopped me. His fingers hovered above the keys, and the music began again. This time, it was different. The notes were heavier, darker. The air thickened with each passing second, as if the music itself was closing in on me, pushing me back. The woman, who was she, was so close now. I could almost reach her. But just as I took a step forward, the room seemed to tilt. The shadows began to twist violently, stretching toward me, pulling at my very soul. And then, everything exploded. The music surged to a deafening crescendo, and the shadows engulfed me, consuming everything in their path. I was falling through endless darkness, the world spinning and twisting around me. The music, still there, still present, filled every inch of my mind, drowning out everything else. The woman's voice was a distant echo, fading away. And I realized, too late, that there was no escape. The music was all there was. And I had become part of it. The sound of the knock at my door was unsettling. It wasn't the usual rhythmic knock most visitors make. This was sharp, harsh, almost deliberate, as though whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. My hand froze on the arm of the chair where I had been sitting, staring blankly at the wall. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only other noise in the room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor or a delivery. I had been alone for months now, and the quiet had become my only companion. The solitude, while once a curse, had become familiar, even comforting. So why did that knock make my skin crawl? Why did a knot form in the pit of my stomach? The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated. My pulse quickened. There was something off about it, something wrong. My eyes darted to the door, my mind racing with questions. Was it someone I knew? A stranger? A prank? I stood up, but my legs felt like lead. The room seemed to close in on me, the familiar walls suddenly feeling too narrow, too confining. My breathing grew shallow. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to know who was on the other side. But I had to. I had to see for myself. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle. The cold metal sent a shiver up my spine. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't work. There was no turning back now. I swung the door open. There, standing in front of me, was someone I hadn't seen in years. A face I thought I had buried deep in the past. He looked almost the same, though time had taken its toll on him. His hair, once dark, was now streaked with gray. His eyes, once full of mischief, were empty, vacant. But it was him. It was Jason. The one person I thought I'd never have to face again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stood frozen in place, unable to move or make a sound. Jason's eyes lingered on me, as if he were waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. "Can I come in?" he finally asked, his voice flat and emotionless. The simple question sent a jolt through me. Something about the way he spoke, so casually, like no time had passed, made my heart race. I wanted to slam the door in his face. I wanted to scream at him to leave. But instead, I just stood there, staring at him. Staring at the ghost of my past. Jason took a step forward, as if he could sense my hesitation. I could hear his breath now, shallow and uneven. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, trying to gather the courage to say something, anything, but my mouth felt dry, like I had forgotten how to speak. "I just need to talk," Jason said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Just for a minute. It's important." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to send him away, to tell him to leave me alone, to let the past stay buried where it belonged. But another part of me, an uneasy, terrified part, felt drawn to him, to the words he hadn't said yet, to the reason he was here. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. "Fine," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason walked in, his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. He didn't look at me as he passed, his gaze fixed ahead, as though he were walking into some familiar space he had been in 1,000 times before. I closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch clicking too loudly in the stillness. He stood there, in the middle of my living room, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. The silence between us was suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator again, the only sound in the room, but even that felt too loud now, too intrusive. "Why are you here, Jason?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" Jason's eyes shifted to meet mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in them. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't tell. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the same emptiness behind. "I've been thinking about the past," he said slowly, his voice low. "About everything we left behind. And I thought maybe it was time we talked. To clear the air." The words sent a chill through me. The past. It had been so long since I thought about it, since I'd allowed myself to even remember. Jason was part of that past, part of a chapter of my life I tried to forget. The things that had happened then still haunted me, even in the quiet of my solitude. And now, he was here. To bring it all back. "Jason, I don't want to talk about it," I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "I don't want to dredge it all up again." He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. The air felt thicker now, as if it were pressing in on me. My heartbeat quickened. I could feel the tension building, like a storm that had been waiting to break. And then, just as I thought I might scream, the silence was shattered by the faint sound of footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Footsteps that didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. They echoed in the room, growing louder, closer, until they were right behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. No one. But Jason. Jason wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was fixed on something behind me, his eyes wide with a look of horror that made my blood run cold. And that's when I realized something wasn't right. Not with him. Not with me. But with this place. Something was here. Something had always been here. And I had no idea what it was. Jason's eyes were locked on the space behind me, his expression shifting from confusion to pure terror. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I turned slowly to glance over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone or something standing there. But there was nothing. The room was still. Too still. The only sound now was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a constant reminder of how ordinary everything should be. But in that silence, the atmosphere felt wrong, charged, like the air before a storm. My heart raced, and I could hear the frantic pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I turned back to Jason, who had gone pale, his lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. "What's wrong?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. His gaze flickered between me and the empty space behind me, and his chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths. The terror in his eyes was contagious. I swallowed hard, trying to remain calm, but the unease in the room was palpable. Something was wrong. Something was here. And it wasn't just in Jason's head. I took a cautious step back, my eyes never leaving him. "Jason? What are you looking at? What's happening?" He didn't respond at first. His body was tense, rigid, like he was frozen in place. Then, his eyes slowly shifted back to me, but there was no recognition in them, no connection. His pupils were dilated, his face almost gaunt. For a brief moment, I didn't know if I was looking at the same person who had knocked on my door just moments ago. It felt like he wasn't really there, not in the way I remembered him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It's here. It's watching us." His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could say anything, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. It was as if the very walls of my apartment were closing in, suffocating me. My breath quickened as I struggled to breathe, the room spinning slightly. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of place. Everything was still the same, except for this presence. This feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I needed to break the silence, needed to understand what was happening. "Jason, what do you mean? What's here? What's watching us?" His eyes darted to the door, his body twitching as if he wanted to flee. But he didn't move. I shouldn't have come," he muttered. "It's not safe here. You shouldn't have let me in." I took a step forward, desperate for some kind of answer. "Jason, what's going on? Talk to me." He shook his head violently. "You don't understand. You don't know what you've let into this place." His words, strained and panicked, only heightened the knot in my stomach. I felt my palms grow sweaty, the room feeling smaller and smaller. My legs were like jelly, threatening to give out beneath me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand that he explain himself, but I couldn't find the words. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable, until, crack, a sound like something snapping echoed from behind me. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The tension in the air thickened, and I could almost feel the weight of the unseen presence pressing down on me. The sound had been subtle, but it was there, like the faintest whisper of a movement, something shifting just outside my line of sight. I stood frozen, straining to hear anything that might break the deafening silence, but there was nothing. Jason was still staring at the space behind me, his eyes wide with fear. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. I took another step backward, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, but nothing made sense. How could this be happening? Why was Jason acting like this? And why did it feel like something was there? My hand instinctively went to the door, my fingers curling around the handle. I had to get out of here. Whatever was happening, I couldn't stay in this room with Jason anymore. I had to find out what was going on, and to escape this growing sense of dread. But before I could turn the handle, I heard something. A sound. A voice. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again, clear this time. It was soft, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around me. Leave. I froze, my blood running cold. I glanced over at Jason, who was now backing away, his eyes wide in panic, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. He was terrified, no, frozen, as if the very air had paralyzed him. Leave, the whisper came again, closer this time. I turned, searching desperately for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The apartment was still. Too still. But the whisper, it didn't feel like it was coming from within the room. It felt as though it was seeping in from somewhere else, like it was part of the very walls themselves. My throat tightened. My legs were unsteady beneath me, and I could feel the air growing colder. I reached out, my hand shaking, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained stuck, as though something on the other side was holding it closed. Panic surged through me, and I jerked harder, pulling with all my strength. The door finally gave way, but it was like pushing through molasses. The coldness from the hallway rushed in, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth inside. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, no, not a shadow, but something darting across the far side of the room. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The door slammed open in my hands, and I ran. I didn't look back as I stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was racing, too many thoughts, too many questions. But all I could focus on was the feeling of something behind me, something just out of reach. A presence that seemed to follow my every movement, pressing against my back like a cold, unseen hand. I slammed the door behind me, but the force of it was too weak. The door creaked and groaned, as though resisting my desperate attempts to close it. It felt wrong. It shouldn't have been that hard to shut, not with the momentum I had. My heart was hammering in my chest as I yanked the door again, harder this time. The hinges protested, and finally it clicked shut. But the sense of unease didn't leave. I took a few unsteady steps into the narrow hallway, the air thick with a heavy silence. The apartment was quiet now, too quiet. It was as though all the sounds had been swallowed up, leaving only the pounding of my own heart. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator had vanished. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I could still hear Jason's voice, whispering in my mind. Leave. It's not safe here. You shouldn't have let me in. The words echoed through my thoughts, a constant reminder of whatever it was that had taken hold of him. Was it just fear? Or was there something more? Something other than what I could see or understand? My eyes scanned the hallway, trying to find something, anything normal. The walls were lined with dim, yellowed wallpaper that hadn't been replaced in years. The faint smell of old wood and dust hung in the air, and a flickering light bulb overhead cast strange, twitching shadows. I felt my hands start to sweat, but I wiped them on my jeans, trying to steady myself. A creak from behind me. I froze. My skin prickled as I turned slowly, expecting to see the door opening again, but nothing was there. Nothing moved. Yet, the sound was unmistakable, a floorboard groaning under weight. I stepped back toward the apartment door, my back pressed against the wall, but my eyes never left the hallway. I could feel the tension in the air, thickening, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took another step back, and the floor beneath me shifted again, but this time I saw it, a shadow stretching across the floor. It was small, indistinct at first, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. But then it grew, curling toward me with unnatural speed, like a creature taking shape. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively reached for the door handle, but I didn't dare take my eyes off the shadow. It moved, and I moved with it, almost in sync, as though it could predict my every action. The shadow stretched longer, creeping across the floor and up the walls. My breath caught in my throat as the shape became clearer, a figure. Or rather, the impression of one. A shifting, formless outline that flickered and melted in and out of existence. I could hear the whisper again, not from my mind this time, but from the figure itself. Soft and slow, like it was pulling the words from the air around us. Leave. I slammed the door open behind me, my eyes still locked on the shifting shape. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything that could be explained. But it was there, and it was coming closer. My fingers trembled around the door handle, and the space between me and the thing in the hallway was closing fast. I needed to move. I needed to get away. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt like lead. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed. And then, in the moment I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard a knock. A knock on the door. It was soft at first, but it grew louder with each tap, each rap that echoed through the quiet of the hallway. My chest tightened, the air growing colder. I turned my head sharply, eyes darting toward the door. But I couldn't move. Not anymore. The knock sounded again. Louder. And then, without warning, the door handle began to turn. The sound was unmistakable. Slow. Methodical. Like someone was casually unlocking the door from the outside. I didn't dare breathe. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but there was no rational thought that could explain the terror I felt in that moment. I looked around, desperate for an escape, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. No doors, no windows, just the dark, oppressive air that seemed to close in with every passing second. The door to my apartment opened, but no one was there. The door was wide open, and the apartment, my apartment, was dark. Empty. But the sound of someone, or something, walking across the floor was unmistakable. Each footfall was deliberate, calculated, like it was moving with purpose. I took one step back, then another, the icy grip of panic wrapping itself around my throat. My breath was shallow now, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. My head spun. Was I going crazy? Was any of this real? I had no time to answer the question, because from the other end of the hallway, I heard something else. The whisper. It was clearer this time. Closer. And then, louder, just before the light flickered and went out. Leave. I didn't dare move. The air in the hallway felt thick, as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath in the silence. The door to my apartment was wide open, and yet there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of my own shallow breathing, the frantic pounding of my heart in my chest. The darkness in the apartment seemed to stretch, consuming the space like a living thing, swallowing up the faint light from the hallway. I stepped forward, my feet hesitant, like they were dragging through molasses. Each movement felt unnatural, as though my body was betraying me. I tried to focus on something, anything, but the silence was too loud. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, growing heavier with each passing second. the whisper was gone. The footsteps had stopped. But that only made the situation worse. What had been there before, the shape, the thing in the hallway, had vanished, leaving me alone with my fear. And yet, the apartment felt alive, as though it were waiting, watching. I reached the doorway, and the moment I stepped into the room, something changed. The air shifted. It was colder now, a chill that ran down my spine and made the hairs on my neck stand on end. My eyes searched the darkness, trying to make sense of the shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally, as if they were no longer bound to the laws of light and shadow. I stepped further in, my breath now caught in my throat. The apartment was still empty, still silent, but the floor creaked underfoot. The same sound I had heard just moments ago, echoing through the apartment from somewhere unseen. I froze, my eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of movement. My thoughts raced, but there was nothing. No explanation. I took another cautious step. My hands were trembling now, the anxiety building in my chest. I reached out, slowly, to turn on the light, but before I could, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to linger the longest, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I turned sharply, my body instinctively stepping back as I tried to focus on whatever it was. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then the shape took form. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. It was something else. A figure in the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the faint light filtering in from the hallway. I could make out the outline of a face, pale and twisted. It was barely visible, just a shadow in the corner of the room, but it was there. And it was watching me. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I opened my eyes again, the figure was closer. The shape was clearer, though still indistinct, like it was made of smoke, something that didn't belong in the physical world. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. The air grew thick around me, suffocating, like it was pressing me into the ground. I couldn't breathe properly. I could only stare at the figure as it moved toward me, its face now more distinct, more horrifying. It was no longer a blur. The face that stared at me was wrong. Its features were contorted, stretched in unnatural ways. The eyes were wide, unblinking, black as coal, and the mouth. It was a jagged line of teeth, twisted into a grin that seemed to stretch too far. But what terrified me most was the expression. It wasn't human. It was empty, hollow, like there was nothing behind the eyes. It was coming closer. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The room was closing in on me. The shadows, thick and oppressive, seemed to shift and swirl around the figure, pulling at my senses, making everything feel distorted, wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It was standing only a few feet away from me now, the air between us thick with an unbearable tension. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The silence between us was more terrifying than any sound could ever be. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a drum. The room seemed to tremble with the force of it. But the figure just stood there, watching me, its grin widening impossibly, as though it found my fear amusing. And then, it moved again. It wasn't a natural movement. It was jerky, like it was made of something that shouldn't be able to move the way it did. The figure took a step toward me, then another, and I could feel my breath quickening, my pulse racing in my throat. But I couldn't move. I couldn't run. As it came closer, I could hear it now, its breath, sharp and ragged. But it wasn't a breath like mine. It was hollow, like air was being forced through a constricted throat. It was unnatural. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand grip my wrist. The touch sent a jolt of ice through my veins, freezing me in place. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The room spun. My vision blurred. I tried to pull away, but the grip only tightened. It felt like it was sinking into my skin, like the hand wasn't just holding me but becoming part of me, pulling me into its cold, suffocating presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was feel the pressure of the hand, the weight of the air, the terror that crushed my chest. And then I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Leave. It wasn't Jason's voice. It wasn't anything familiar. It was it. The thing that had been watching me. The thing that had been waiting for me to cross that line. And as the voice whispered again, louder this time, my vision went black. I woke to darkness. It was thick, suffocating, but it wasn't the same kind of darkness I'd felt before. It felt alive, pressing against my skin, swirling in the corners of the room. The coldness of it clung to me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. My head pounded, and I could feel a dull, persistent ache behind my eyes, like a drumbeat echoing in my skull. I tried to move, but my body was heavy, sluggish, as if I were waking from a nightmare that had somehow bled into reality. My hands were trembling, my fingers cold as I instinctively reached for the sides of the bed. But then I froze. Something was wrong. The room. It wasn't the same. The familiar clutter of my apartment, the quiet comfort I'd once known, had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The walls felt close, too close. The floor seemed uneven beneath me, shifting with a subtle instability. I tried to make sense of it, but my thoughts felt too tangled, as if they were trapped in a fog. I forced my eyes open. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the curtains barely illuminated the room, but it was enough for me to see the outline of the door, my apartment door, still wide open. I didn't remember leaving it that way. I pushed myself up, my chest tightening as panic began to claw its way back into my mind. The memory of that figure, the thing with the distorted grin and the cold hand, rushed back to me like a tidal wave. My breath quickened, and I had to fight to keep my mind from spiraling into chaos. Had it all been real? Or was I losing my mind? I swung my legs over the side of the bed, planting my feet on the floor, and stood. My knees felt weak, unsteady, but I managed to find my balance. The apartment was eerily still. Too still. I stepped cautiously toward the door, each footstep heavier than the last. My senses felt hyper-alert, as if every creak of the floorboard beneath me might signal something terrible, something waiting just beyond my reach. As I crossed the threshold of the bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the shadows creeping in the corners of my vision, it was something else. Something lurking, waiting for me to make the next move. I entered the living room, and that's when I saw it. The figure from before, the one in the corner of the room, was now gone. But its presence lingered, like a stain on the air. The chill hadn't dissipated, and the darkness still seemed to be moving, slowly, subtly, like the room itself was shifting in and out of reality. I hesitated, my eyes scanning every inch of the room, desperate for some explanation. But there was nothing. Just the faintest echo of that breath, soft, ragged, but unmistakably there. Then, my gaze landed on something that made my stomach twist with dread. The door was still open. But now, there was something lying in the doorway, something small, delicate. A broken watch. It was mine. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My hand shot to my wrist, but the watch wasn't there. I knew I hadn't left it on the floor, but there it was, fractured, twisted, its hand stopped at a time I couldn't remember. I bent down, my body trembling, and picked it up. The metal felt cold against my fingertips, the glass cracked, a web of jagged lines cutting across the surface. And then I noticed something that made my heart stop, a faint, almost imperceptible smear of dark red on the back of the watch. My blood ran cold. Was it mine? I stumbled back, panic seizing me once more. My mind was racing, but the thoughts wouldn't come together. Everything felt fragmented, like I was grasping at pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. The cold that had settled in my chest now spread through my limbs, numbing everything, drowning out any sense of clarity. I couldn't trust my senses. I couldn't trust myself. I turned toward the hallway again, knowing deep down that I needed to get out of the apartment. I couldn't stay here, couldn't face whatever was waiting for me. But the door wasn't just open. It was slightly ajar, as if someone had been in here after me, standing in the shadows, just out of reach. And that's when I heard it. A voice. A whisper, low and deliberate, coming from the darkness of the hallway. It wasn't a sound I recognized. It wasn't Jason's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice I knew. But it was close. Too close. Leave, it murmured, the word dragging like a claw across my spine. I bolted. I didn't even think. I ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I made my way to the front door. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. My heart leaped into my throat, panic threatening to consume me. I yanked harder, but the door remained locked, and the darkness behind me grew. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. And then the door behind me creaked open, slowly, deliberately. And there, in the doorway, stood a figure. Not Jason. Not anyone I knew. But the same twisted, distorted grin. It stepped forward, its movement unnaturally jerky, like it was piecing itself together as it moved. I screamed, but the sound never left my throat. The figure reached out, its hand cold, its fingers stretching as it came closer. And with every step it took, the air grew heavier, suffocating me, until all I could feel was the weight of its presence pressing down on me. I couldn't escape. And then, just before its hand could touch me, the world went black. It was late. Too late. I never expected anything unusual on a night like this, but there I was, standing at the entrance of my apartment building, staring at the hallway like it was something completely alien to me. The dull glow of the hallway lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that made the otherwise familiar space feel unnerving. The kind of shadows that, when caught out of the corner of your eye, seem to shift just enough to make you question whether you're really seeing them at all. I was exhausted, my feet dragging as I made my way to the door. Another long day. Another day that stretched on forever, filled with faces that didn't matter, work that didn't excite me, and thoughts I couldn't shake. But when I opened the door to my apartment, it wasn't the normal quiet I expected. No, something was wrong. Something wasn't right. I froze in the doorway. The hallway was covered in blood. Red streaks smeared along the walls, pooling in patches on the floor, marking the path like a trail from a nightmare. My heart began to pound in my chest, blood rushing in my ears as I stared at the gruesome sight before me. It was too much to process, too much to comprehend. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Every muscle in my body locked up, a deep sense of confusion settling over me. I lived alone. I knew I did. The idea of anyone else being here, in my apartment, was impossible. I had been at work all day. I had walked in just now, and yet this was in my home. I stepped into the hallway, the soles of my shoes sticking to the floor. The blood, fresh and thick, was everywhere. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling had splashes of it, as though someone had dragged their hand along it, smearing the scarlet stains wherever they could reach. I stumbled forward, feeling the floor shift beneath me. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the smell, sharp and metallic, clung to the air. It was so real. So real. My mind raced. Who? What? How? But no answers came. The sound of my own breath was the only thing I could hear now, the rest of the world fading away, overshadowed by the pulse of panic beating through me. I moved further down the hallway, the walls now seeming to close in around me. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Not even a creak of the floorboards. No distant hum of the refrigerator. Just silence. And blood. Then I saw something. Something that made my stomach twist, that made my breath catch in my throat. There, at the end of the corridor, was a door. My door. But something was wrong with it too. The knob, it was twisted, turned at an unnatural angle. Almost as if it had been forced. I wanted to turn back, to leave the apartment and go anywhere else. But my feet wouldn't move. I had to know. I had to understand. Why was there blood? And where had it come from? I took a few more steps, each one more hesitant than the last. The blood was still wet, still fresh. My mind struggled to grasp it. How had this happened? The idea of a break-in didn't make sense. If someone had been here, surely there would be more signs of a struggle. But there was nothing, just the blood. And the overwhelming silence. I reached for the door handle. My fingers trembled, the cold metal sending a jolt of panic through my body. The instant I touched it, the door creaked open on its own, as though something had already been waiting for me. And then, I saw it. The room, my room, was the same as I had left it. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing was out of place. But the blood was everywhere. It had splashed across my couch, the carpet, the walls, and even dripped down from the ceiling. There were no signs of a person. No movement. Just the blood. Just the stain. I couldn't make sense of it. My breath caught in my chest, the panic quickly turning into something worse, something deeper. I stepped back, my hand shaking as I reached for my phone in my pocket. My heart was racing. There had to be an explanation. A logical one. A reasonable one. I dialed the police. But before I could hit the call button, the phone slid from my hand and clattered to the floor. A sound. A movement. The air shifted, just enough for me to feel it. Something was in the apartment with me. I whipped around, the blood still dripping from the walls. I could hear the soft scrape of shoes on the wooden floor behind me. Someone, or something, was moving through the apartment, moving closer. I couldn't see it. I couldn't hear it clearly, but I felt it. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, as the temperature in the room dropped, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, in a voice so soft it almost didn't exist, I heard it. "I've been waiting for you." I froze. The voice was barely a whisper, but it sliced through the silence of the apartment like a razor. My heart hammered in my chest, thudding so loudly I thought it might echo through the walls. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn around, to confront whatever was lurking behind me, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, rooted to the floor, unwilling to obey. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. Every instinct I had told me to flee, but where could I go? How could I escape when the very space around me seemed to warp, to shift in a way that was impossible to comprehend? I stood there, trembling, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of the presence that was so close. The blood on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, none of it made sense. Nothing in the apartment made sense. It was as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled in that instant. Another sound. This time it was a scrape, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of the shadows pooling in the corner of the room. Something was there. It was barely visible, just a vague shape in the dim light. But I could feel it. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. My breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and warping, but there was no clear shape, no clear form. It was like trying to look at something underwater, distorted, shifting, just out of reach. Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice weak and trembling. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and I could see my breath misting in the air. A chill seeped into my bones, but it wasn't just the cold. It was something else. Something darker. And then, from the shadows, a figure began to take shape. At first, it was nothing more than a distortion in the air, a vague outline that flickered and twisted as though it didn't quite belong to this world. But slowly, agonizingly slowly, it became more solid, more real. I saw a face. It was pale, impossibly pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its features were distorted, like a face that had been molded from clay and then twisted out of shape, leaving behind something grotesque. The mouth was twisted into a faint, sickly smile, but it didn't reach the eyes. No, the eyes were cold, lifeless, empty, like black holes. I stumbled back, my hands reaching out to steady myself, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. It was watching me. Waiting. Why? Why are you here?" I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. It didn't answer. Instead, the figure began to move. Not with the fluidity of a person, but with a jerking, unnatural motion, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Its limbs were too long, too thin, stretching in ways that didn't seem possible, bending at impossible angles. As it took a step forward, the blood on the floor seemed to shift, pooling around its feet, as if it were feeding off the darkness itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only watch as it came closer, its steps slow and deliberate, each movement sending a chill down my spine. The blood on the walls flickered like firelight, casting strange, twisted shadows across the room. I don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure's head tilted slightly, its hollow eyes narrowing as if it were considering my words, studying me. It took another step forward, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was close now. Too close. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, in the dead silence that followed, I heard the voice again, this time right beside my ear. "You're not supposed to be here," it whispered. "You never were." I gasped, stumbling back, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they had turned to jelly, and I knew that if I didn't act, if I didn't get out of there, I wouldn't make it out alive. The figure reached out with one long, twisted hand, and I finally snapped into motion. My body moved on its own, adrenaline flooding my system, pushing me to the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the handle. I could hear it behind me, its slow, measured steps, the scrape of its feet against the floor. It was coming. With a desperate cry, I threw the door open, rushing into the hallway. But when I looked around, when I tried to orient myself, something felt wrong. The hallway was different now. The walls were no longer the same. They were warped, bent in unnatural ways, like the very structure of the building had been twisted. The blood everywhere was still there, but it was smeared differently. More intensely. The smell, it was overpowering now, almost nauseating. The shadows were alive. I could feel them. I could hear them moving, whispering. I turned, expecting to see something chasing me, but nothing. Just the oppressive silence. The weight of the air pressing in around me. And then, I heard it again, the voice. Not from the figure, but from all around me. "You should have never come back." I stood there, my breath shallow, my heart thundering in my ears. The air around me felt thick, oppressive. Every corner of the apartment now seemed unfamiliar, foreign. I could still feel the blood beneath my feet, the sticky, almost pulsing warmth that soaked through my socks as I backed away from the wall. The whispers, the shadows, everything in the hallway was closing in on me. I had no idea where I was anymore. Was this real? Was this happening? The voice, soft and insistent, echoed again from all directions. "You should have never come back." I blinked, forcing my mind to focus. There was no way out. The door to the outside was at the far end of the hall, but somehow it felt farther away now. My legs were stiff, as if something were holding me in place. The sense of dread, of something watching me, was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were shifting, closing in, narrowing the path to the exit. I turned in a panic, looking for any means of escape, any sign of life. The apartment, my home, the place that had always felt safe, now felt like a labyrinth, like a death trap I couldn't escape from. The shadows didn't belong, they moved, they crept. There was a dark presence in every corner. The shadows are alive. The thought crossed my mind like a cold shiver. No, I was just imagining things. I had to focus. My mind raced. Was I losing my grip on reality? Then, the footsteps started. At first, it was just a soft thud. Faint, almost imperceptible. But soon enough, it grew louder, closer. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight of someone, or something, moving toward me. There was no mistaking it now. These weren't my footsteps, not the sound of my own movement. These were something else, heavier, deliberate. I whipped my head around. No one was there. But the sound, it was getting closer. The air turned colder, the temperature dropping to an almost unbearable level. I could see my breath in front of me, fogging up in the dim hallway light. The cold crept into my bones, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I had to move, but my feet wouldn't obey. The shadows seemed to stretch, grow longer, as though reaching toward me, drawn to my very presence. I could see them shift, darting in and out of sight, like something was hiding just out of reach. It was as though they were alive, as though they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up. Where is it coming from? My mind was a tangled mess of confusion. I wasn't sure if I was still in the hallway of my apartment or if I had somehow crossed over into something else. The hallway seemed to twist and bend, the walls pulling away, then constricting, suffocating me. I forced myself to look at the door, at the one escape that was supposed to lead to safety. But when I tried to step forward, I stumbled. Something caught my leg. I looked down. A trail of blood. It wasn't just on the walls now. It was on the floor, beneath me, sticky and fresh. Like it was following me, as if something, or someone, was bleeding just steps behind me. I swore I saw a dark shape move across the floor, disappearing into the shadows. The footsteps came again, louder this time. So loud, I could feel them vibrating through the floorboards, through the very walls. The air felt like it was alive, pressing against me from all sides. I stumbled again, my hand slamming into the wall beside me as I tried to keep myself from falling. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The figure was much clearer now, more solid. I could see it, a tall, gaunt shape standing at the far end of the hallway. Its face was still just a blur, like a silhouette caught in the periphery of my vision. But I could sense it. I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, waiting. It knew me. I could feel it in my chest, like an icy hand was clutching my heart. The figure took a step forward, then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring my terror. "No," I whispered, the word barely escaping my throat. "No, no, no." The walls closed in around me, and I could hear the sound of my own panicked breathing. My vision blurred, and I staggered backward, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle. But the door wasn't there anymore. There was nothing but darkness. "Where's the door?" I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, searching for any sign of escape, any way out. But the hallway was now unrecognizable. The walls weren't even walls anymore. They had turned into a twisted, shifting mass, stretching and contorting in ways I couldn't explain. It was like the entire world around me was warping. I was trapped. The figure moved closer. Closer. It didn't walk anymore. It glided, floating just above the ground, its arms stretching unnaturally long, fingers like claws reaching toward me. Its face was clearer now. Pale, almost translucent. The eyes, those empty, dark pits, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then it spoke. A voice, hollow, distant, yet filled with an unearthly malice. "You're mine now." It reached out. I screamed. The scream caught in my throat as the figure's hand came toward me, its fingers reaching with unnatural speed, like a spider's legs on a broken web. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, my mind screaming for me to move, to get away. but there was nowhere to run. The hallway, the entire space, felt like a prison now. The walls seemed to press in, their shadows stretching, growing, swallowing up any light that remained. I tried to speak, to shout for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The figure loomed closer, its feet barely touching the ground, the air around it growing colder with every inch it moved. My legs trembled beneath me, and I found myself backing into the corner of the hallway, my body pressing against the cold, damp wall. This isn't real. The thought echoed in my mind, but it felt like a lie. I could feel the cold radiating from the creature, and the scent that filled the air, rotting flesh, something decayed and foul, was all too real. My stomach churned. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, its face now fully visible in the dim light, or what little light remained. Its skin was stretched too tight, the bones beneath visible, jagged and raw. There were no eyes, just hollow, dark voids, as if it had never been human. The grin that stretched across its face was wide and inhuman, a gaping maw filled with sharp, broken teeth. "You should have never returned," it whispered, its voice like the creak of rusted metal, scraping along my skin. The words reverberated in my chest, rattling my bones. I wanted to scream again, but all I could manage was a breathless gasp. What was this thing? Why was it here? Why now? The hallway seemed to distort around me, the floor tilting, the walls twisting, like the very structure of the apartment was being bent to its will. I pressed myself harder into the corner, but the shadows moved, closing in. The creature's breath was a cold wind that brushed against my skin, making me shiver. No, no, no! I pushed against the wall, desperate to escape, but the air was thick, heavy, like I was breathing through wet cloth. It felt like my body was moving through molasses, every step I took in slow motion, as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep me in place. The figure tilted its head, observing me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against me. Its lips curled into a smile that made my stomach lurch. "You think you can run from me?" it hissed. It was then that I noticed something on the floor beneath me. I looked down, and there, soaked into the carpet, were more bloodstains. But they weren't just stains. They formed shapes, like patterns, almost words. I squinted, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it. The blood was forming something familiar, something terrifying. My name. I could feel my pulse quicken as the realization hit me. It knows me. It knows who I am. It had been waiting for me to come back. The figure took a step closer, its grin widening even more. It wasn't just watching me anymore, it was studying me, analyzing me, as if it could see every secret I had ever kept buried. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't get away. "I've been here longer than you know," the creature whispered, its voice slithering into my mind. "Longer than you've been alive." I tried to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My heart raced, my mind spun, and the walls seemed to pulse around me, beating with an unnatural rhythm. The creature's hand shot forward, fingers reaching out with a speed I couldn't comprehend. I closed my eyes. And then everything stopped. Silence. Complete silence. I opened my eyes slowly, terrified to find the figure looming over me. But it was gone. I was alone again in the hallway. Had it all been a hallucination? My chest was tight, my breath shallow as I stood there, frozen in place. The bloodstains on the floor had vanished, the walls were still. Everything looked the same. but the air felt different. Heavy, unnatural. My heart thudded in my chest, but there was no sound, no footsteps. It was as though the house had settled back into its normal, mundane state. But the weight of the moment lingered, pressing down on me. I was no longer sure what was real. Was it just a dream? Was it real? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that clouded my thoughts. I had to get out of this place. I had to leave before it came back. I rushed toward the front door, my hands fumbling as I tried to turn the doorknob. But it wouldn't budge. No. No, no, no. I twisted it harder, pulling with all my strength, but it stayed locked. The cold sweat on my skin was like ice. I stepped back, panting, my heart racing. The air around me thickened again, and I could feel it. It was coming back. The air grew colder still, as if the very space around me was absorbing every last ounce of warmth. My breath came out in shaky puffs, white against the darkness of the hallway. I could feel it. It was there. I couldn't see it, not yet, but I could feel its presence growing, expanding like a thick fog, choking me. It was coming closer. I twisted the doorknob again, desperate, my hands slick with sweat. Why won't it open? Panic clawed at my chest. The shadows seemed to deepen, shifting with slow, deliberate intent. It was a suffocating weight, as if the very walls were closing in on me. It knows me. The thought gnawed at the edges of my mind like a rat nibbling at old cheese. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching me. It had been waiting. And now, it wasn't going to let me leave. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, endless and unforgiving. The overhead light flickered, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I glanced down at my feet. The bloodstains, the ones that had vanished, were back. Not just the floor this time, but the walls too. They were smeared with dark, sticky streaks of crimson, like someone had dragged their hand along the surface. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There was something off about the blood. It doesn't look real. It didn't have that usual metallic sheen. It was darker, thicker, almost unnatural. Something was wrong. Something had always been wrong. I backed away from the door, unable to tear my eyes from the bloodstains. I tried to push the thought away, tried to convince myself it wasn't real. It's just in my head. But every inch of me screamed that this was more than just my mind playing tricks. This was something far worse. I spun on my heel, looking down the length of the corridor. The end of the hall was still shrouded in darkness, but I could sense it now. A presence. It's watching me. And then, there it was, a creak. At first, it was so faint, so quiet that I wasn't sure it had even happened. But then it came again. Creak. The floorboard beneath me shifted, and I was sure someone, or something, was there. A faint shuffling sound, followed by the unmistakable thump of feet dragging across the floor. I froze. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Too close. My heart pounded in my ears. The air was thick with the smell of that rotting stench again, suffocating me. It was no longer just a faint smell. It was overpowering, burning my nostrils, filling my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I turned, ready to run, but there was nowhere to go. No way out. The door was still locked. And behind me, the shuffling grew louder, more frantic. It was right there, right behind me. The sensation of it, cold and heavy, clawing at my back, was so intense that I couldn't move. Stop! I gasped, unable to stop myself from pleading. I heard a low, raspy chuckle from behind me, the sound crawling under my skin, making my spine curl. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. I spun around, my legs barely holding me up as I stared into the hallway. The shadows were deepening once again. And then, there it was. A figure. A shape in the dark. A hulking silhouette that was almost more shadow than substance. Its body seemed to blur, shifting in and out of focus, like it was made of smoke and mist. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it. The eyes. Or what should have been eyes. Empty, hollow, dark pits where something used to be. Its mouth stretched too wide, impossibly wide, with teeth that glistened in the faint light, sharp and broken, jagged like shards of glass. It was here. "You've been here all along," it whispered, its voice like a crackling fire, low and guttural, but unmistakably mocking. "You just didn't know it." I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning. The blood, the footsteps, the locked door, none of it made sense. I had to get out. I had to escape. I lunged at the door again, my hands shaking violently, but the knob didn't turn. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the space shrinking, the shadows encroaching, swallowing everything in their path. It's real. It's real. I clutched the doorknob tighter, as if holding onto something, anything, could make this stop. The figure took a slow step forward, its foot dragging across the floor, its gaze never leaving mine. My body went cold, and the world around me seemed to blur. This was it. There was no escape. It raised its hand. I could see the long, twisted fingers, each one longer than the last, bent in unnatural angles, stretching out toward me. And then, just as it was about to reach me, the door burst open with a deafening crack. I stumbled backward, falling into the dark room beyond, my breath coming in jagged gasps. But the figure was still there. It was in the shadows, waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room. The darkness was thick, suffocating. I couldn't make out anything. I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was closing in. The air turned colder. The floor creaked beneath me. And then, in the suffocating silence, I heard it, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't run anymore." The door slammed shut behind me. And in the dark, I finally understood. I had never been alone. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.